Well, thank you very much. I think it's clear that something went wrong, and a lot of what we've been talking about is who's to blame with the financial markets, the regulators. Keynes, and it's very appropriate that we're talking about so much of Keynesian economics here at King's College. Keynes talked about the influence of ideas. And once you start talking about the influence of ideas, one has to say among those that have to take blame for the crisis is the economics profession. Not those here, but other economists who are not here. And
only defunct economists.
Well, no. Actually, many of these, the problem is they're not defunct, and that's what this is all about, actually. Perhaps they should be. But anyway. I spent a lot of time in my book Freefall talking about some of this, but what I want this afternoon to talk about is to try to talk a little bit more about modeling, about what kinds of models, what went wrong with the models that economists used, and what are some alternatives. The fact that the fact that something was wrong with the economics model should be clear. Economics is supposed to be a science. A test of a theory is its ability to predict. But most economists and most economic models fail to predict the most important economic event of the last 75 years. It's not a great deal to say the growth today is going to be 3% greater than tomorrow if every year it's about 3% higher. But missing a big event like the crisis is really missing a lot. Anybody who used the Bayesian loss function would say they really got it bad. It's interesting, if you talk to a lot of people in the financial market, a lot of the regulators, people like Greenspan, when they've gone up and talked before the investigations, a common refrain was, who could have predicted? No one predicted it. I was at a meeting in Davos about 2 or 3 years ago when, just at the beginning of the crisis, where the bubble had just broken and the full implications had not yet worked out, and talked about these problems. And there were in the front row a number of central bankers, and they all raised their hand and gave this thing, no one predicted this, no one. And then what was interesting, there was a whole group of other people, about 5 of them, not a large number, who all raised their hands and said, we did. And that actually raises a very deep question that I'm not going to talk about, which is the sociology of knowledge. It was true that none of the central bankers could hear what was being said by any of these other people because they were talking in a different language. And this really goes to the point that Bill White made this morning concerning the discussion at the Federal Reserve. But actually, I think while the mainstream models didn't work very well, there were many strands of economic theory developed over the past quarter century that I think do provide a lot of insight into what happened, provide alternative advice for what to do in responding to the crisis and preventing a recurrence, and are in many other respects much better theories and models. And what I want to do this afternoon is talk about a few of those models. But let me first begin to talk about an example of what went wrong, and that's the standard monetary policy stance, the conventional wisdom that I'm sure none of you teach, but used to be taught. It is still taught in many courses around the world. And there were 7 propositions I put down here. Price stability was necessary and almost sufficient for economic stability. There's no such thing as a bubble. Even if there were a bubble, the effects of its breaking would be contained. Even if there were a bubble, one can't be sure until after it breaks. Even if the Fed realized there was a bubble, it didn't have the tools to deal with the problem. Even if it had the tools, it shouldn't use them. And in the end, it was better to clean up the mess after the bubble breaks than interfere with the market before. These views, I would argue, were based on very, very peculiar models that were not empirically well-grounded. The discussion this morning was really good at highlighting the so-called vertical Phillips curve, when it should have been the horizontal Phillips curve. But the models are not general, not robust, and should not be widely accepted. They are widely accepted. That's the problem. Let me just go through these points very quickly. Price stability was necessary and almost sufficient for economic stability and efficiency. Those models tended to focus on the distortions in relative prices associated with the inefficiency with even low to moderate inflation. But the point is that the economic losses associated with the financial crisis, the financial instability, were orders of magnitude greater than these fourth order effects that the whole economic profession focused on. Look at another example, or another related point brought home very much in the months right before the crisis, where many countries were facing high inflation, but it was imported inflation. It was inflation of food, inflation of energy, and if you used an inflation targeting model, you would have had to kill the entire economy, the 25% of the economy which would be affected by monetary policy to get the inflation rate down. It was just an incoherent theory that was almost universally accepted. The fact that there is no such thing as a bubble, I think, has been refuted by facts. But the point is, there have repeatedly been bubbles. I mean, that was the point of Kindleberger's book and a lot of literature about rational bubbles. So again, hypothesis was almost that there was, it was inconsistent with irrational expectations, but none of them seemed to have read Marcus's paper, which showed that it was consistent. It was just a blinder that they put up. The fact that even if there were a bubble, the effects of its breaking would be contained reflected the notion that we had diversified risk. And that, in a way, is the most serious mystery of the crisis. And I'll come back to try to explain why that was. But it has something to do about the structure of the economy, the kinds of things that Axel was talking about, and that we were talking about, network externalities that we talked about earlier. The fourth proposition, even if there were a bubble, you can't be sure until after it breaks, really represents a misunderstanding of policy, because all policy is done in the presence of uncertainty. And when you saw those numbers of the kind that Franklin showed, where you get those prices, the price soaring like that, historically unprecedented, you may not be sure there's a bubble, but you could be pretty sure, and your policies ought to reflect that subjective probability judgment. And the fact that at that point, Greenspan, when asked about was there a bubble, could reply, oh, there's just a little froth, meant either he hadn't studied those diagrams or he was in the state of denial. The fifth statement, even if the Fed realized that there was a bubble, it didn't have the tools to deal with the problem, is just disingenuous. The fact was it had the tools. The Fed gave it the tool, the Congress gave it the tools in 1994. It gave it tools to regulate the housing market. They could have increased loan-to-value ratios, just like in the tech bubble, they could have increased margin requirements. The remarkable thing is, after the tech bubble, a number of us went to talk to the people in the Fed and said, why didn't you do this? And it turned out they had one brief conversation in the run-up of the bubble on margin requirements, just a few minutes, and everybody said, well, Greenspan didn't think it was important, it would distort the economy, as if what has happened has not distorted the economy. So the fact is there are lots of tools that it had at its disposal. May not have solved the problem, we should be clear about that, we don't really know, but it at least had the prospect of dampening the bubble. And the final proposition, I don't think anybody would adhere to today, that it's less costly to clean up the mess than to interfere by distorting markets by, for instance, having a little tighter loan-to-value ratios. I don't think anybody would agree with that today. Well, let me begin by making some remark on how we got into the current mess. And it really goes back about 35 years ago when it was recognized that there was an incoherence between microeconomics and macroeconomics, and a natural desire to try to reconcile these two strands of economic thought. I think that was understandable. But there were two ways to do it. One way was to say something is wrong with the microeconomics, and let's try to make the microeconomics more realistic. The other one was, let's assume the microeconomics of perfect competition, perfect information, all those assumptions, and make our macroeconomics like microeconomics. That was the approach taken by the mainstream, and I think what has gotten us into the current juncture. But I want to echo the remark that was made in the introduction of the section, which was, while they talked about putting macro on firm micro foundations, one has to understand that it wasn't the assumptions that I just described that were critical. It was those assumptions plus the assumption of a representative agent, i.e. one individual, because of this very general theorem that, in fact, in the absence of the representative agent model, virtually any aggregate function can be consistent with the standard competitive model. So that, in fact, all this bit about having strong micro foundations was just a show. It was not really based on any firm intellectual foundations. But the more important point was the one that was emphasized at lunch today, which is that high-level macroeconomic systems may possess new and different properties than the low-level microeconomic systems on which they are based. That is to say, the behavior of gases depend on the behavior of molecules, but they are not exactly the same. That is to say, you have to derive them using statistical mechanics. The conventional approach had the macro basically replicate the micro and left out the opportunity for doing this. Well, the model failed in many ways, and one of the critical tasks going forward for the research agenda is to answer the question, which of the many unrealistic assumptions that went into that model are critical. For instance, we talked about the representative agent assumption. There are assumptions about competition, rational expectations, efficient markets, distinctions between risk and uncertainty, labor market assumptions, assumptions about corporate governance, capital markets, and so forth. There's a long list, and as far as research strategy is, which of these do we want to drop? Well, I think this goes back to this pluralism. I think that is very important. I think we have to investigate a number of different models where different assumptions are dropped. I'm going to try to suggest what I think are in my mind, some of the critical ones. But the research agenda has to focus on which of these are the most important. So, for instance, I think that one can get an awful lot of the bad behavior that we've seen out of models with rational expectations, but not common knowledge. That's the kind of thing that Marcus emphasized. So you can have rational expectations, but not common knowledge, differential information, and get a lot of the problems. Do I believe that people have rational expectations? No. I think that's a really bad assumption. But as far as a modeling strategy, I think one has to analytically try to separate out different parts of, where do the problems arise. So this is a modeling, a research strategy, if I assume rational expectations, it's not because I believe it is a good assumption. I think it's really as part of the research strategy, we have to sort of try to figure out where does the failure lie, partly as a matter of persuasion, but also partly as a matter, an analytic matter. I want to emphasize, reiterate the point that Axel made about the labor market assumptions, the rigidity there assumption. An awful lot of the New Keynesian model, a whole strand of New Keynesian theory, is based on the assumption that the underlying problem is wage rigidity. That is, I think, a wrong assumption and a dangerous assumption. It's a dangerous assumption because if wage rigidity is the problem, then the solution is making labor wages more flexible. And you will hear some central bankers, not far from here, talking about lowering wages as the solution to the problem. But if you're working in a model of Keynesian economics, you start worrying about lowering wages, leading to less aggregate demand and worsening the problem, and getting into exacerbating the Fisherian problem of debt deflation. And there are lots of models. I feel very strongly about this because Bruce Greenwald and I have spent a lot of time over the last 20 years developing theories of debt deflation and arguing that, in fact, those are probably have more explanatory power for economic fluctuations and for the structure of our economy than the rigid wage models that played a very big role in the models that informed central bankers that led them into the current mess. So let me just emphasize that I think we will want to have a multiplicity of approaches, and I want to talk about a number of the ingredients that go into them. Because I think the representative agent model has played such a big role and is such a critical flaw in macroeconomics, I want to spend a little bit of time on that. Obviously, one of the problems is the representative agent, when there's only one person, it does reduce the capability of interaction. And if you believe interactions are central, as the talk this afternoon at lunch did, and I agree with that, you begin your analysis saying they don't exist. I spent a lot of my life worrying about information asymmetries, and again, the representative agent model is inconsistent with that unless the individual suffers from acute schizophrenia. But that kind of acute schizophrenia is inconsistent with the spirit, at least, with the hypothesis of extreme rationality. So it really precludes what I think of as some of the most interesting problems in economics. I think most of us think the core of this crisis is in financial markets, and many of you work in the financial markets. It's hard to have financial markets when there's only one person in the economy. The question of who is lending to whom, if there is a conceptual way you could talk about taking money from your left pocket and giving it to the right pocket, but default is certainly more difficult as a concept. Externalities, which I think are absolutely central if you're going to understand the need for regulation, can't exist in a representative agent because there is no one to be injured by yourself other than yourself. There's no problem of control, that is to say, who makes the decision, because you are the economy. And so you have no difficulty resolving views about what, for instance, the firm should do, or even what is a good theory of the economy. And finally, there's no possibility of predatory behavior. The individual can only prey on himself. So the bottom line, what I want to emphasize here, is the model begins with an assumption that precludes almost everything that we think of as interesting in this crisis. And yet this is the standard model which is taught in most graduate schools around the world. Well, there are 6 other problems I want to talk about very briefly. The next one is also, I think, really important, and that is that there are several aspects of the behavior of the economy that seem so patently inconsistent with any model of rationality, at least any systemic rationality, that attempting to construct a model predicated on rationality that explains such behavior is, I think, almost doomed. And let me give you, there are lots of more, and those of you who think about this who thought about this for very long can give your own list, but let me just mention one, or I list three here. The dividend paradox question is, why do firms pay dividend when there are ways of distributing money from the household from the corporate to the household sector that are taxed much less? Since I wrote about that first in 1973, there's been a change. That is to say, the fraction of money that is distributed that is subjected to dividend tax has gone down, but still it is a large voluntary tax. More interesting from the perspective of the problems that we're facing here is the Modigliani-Miller theorem. The Modigliani-Miller theorem says leverage doesn't matter. Franklin mentioned that in his talk. He mentioned the fact that there is some incentive for increased leverage as a result of dividend tax, but if you look at, as a result of interest deductibility, but if you look at the taxation of capital gains and integrated household and corporate sector and the preferential treatment of capital gains, you get almost no bias. The point is, from a social point of view, and this is really the point of the Modigliani-Miller theorem, from a social point of view, there is no benefit in these models, which were the basis of all the work in finance and all the work that those arguing for all these deregulation, there is no benefit to leverage. There's no social benefit to leverage. But there is a very big social cost, because the larger the leverage, the higher the probability of default, and the higher the default has real social cost. I'll come later to some reasons for why corporate finance matters. It has to do with theories of control, but these are things that are not really incorporated into the standard model. Well, let me talk about a third methodological issue, and that's the role of beliefs. And this was mentioned actually in several talks. I think one of the standard beliefs that we have about macroeconomics is that beliefs are important. They affect behavior. One of the complaints about the rational expectation model is that the beliefs just depend on past data. On the other hand, so many people think that that's too constraining. On the other hand, not all beliefs are possible. Just saying green sprouts didn't restore confidence. Some people in the administration hoped that it would, and that we would have green sprouts if you just said green sprouts, but it didn't work, or it didn't work for very long. But in terms of modeling, there is a real question here. There is a long-standing dispute in macro policy about what it takes to restore confidence. And in a sense, this is a dispute that goes back to the dispute between, I would say, between Hoover and Keynes, or Hoover and Roosevelt, a dispute that is going on, was a dispute between the IMF and me in the East Asia crisis. There are, for instance, one view, which is sometimes viewed as the finance view, which is cutting deficits is necessary to restore credit, to restore confidence. And so you see, what should Greece do? Cut its deficits by cutting spending. The other one is you can restore confidence by restoring economic activity, by stimulating the economy through employment, and that will generate employment and GDP. These two are very different views of the world. Now, the interesting thing is these are not just theological questions. And what's interesting, as I say, for 70 years, this has been a controversy, but the two approaches have sort of existed in parallel without very much effort made to reconcile them. So recently, there's some research by one of my graduate students looking at this, and there's some other people doing work on this, which say that actually surveys do add explanatory power. But this fact itself is a refutation in some sense of the rational expectations model. But they also expand the traditional Keynesian models, which did not include these. It is consistent with different individuals having access to different information, because what interesting things is if you do surveys of expectations by different groups, you see very different behavior. One of the interesting things is that we look at a large number of forecasts by even the best forecasters, the blue chips, and they can be improved by adding publicly available data. So what's interesting is if the best forecasters don't seem to use all the available information, why should we think that the average individual does? It really undermines the rational expectations hypothesis. There are complex methodological issues about aggregation. I want to pass on, though, to talk about equilibrium and disequilibrium. Axel emphasized the fact that the economic system may be unstable in a sense to shocks. A change in the balance sheet, the net worth of an individual can be amplified. And that's really important, understanding the structure of the equilibrium of the whole system to a shock. Most of the economic analyses that we use are really focused on equilibrium models. In fact, most the DSGE, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, is an equilibrium model. And yet most of what we've been talking about is how well does the economic system respond to, is it stable? A lot of that is out of equilibrium behavior. And it's actually, we don't really have very good theories of out of equilibrium behavior. There's a little work Sandy Grossman and I did about equilibrium levels of disequilibrium. There are some really interesting work, some of it done here at Cambridge, like Margaret Bray, about how people learn and is the learning system stable, and it shows that it, in general, is not. So that, in fact, most of the work that you see, though, when people say the economic system is stable, there's very little economic theory underlying that. That's just a religious belief. One, like many religions, turns out not to be right. The crisis provides clear evidence against the hypothesis of efficient markets as well as the hypothesis of rationality. I want to just mention, though, that it's not just that people acted in a seemingly irrational way, but that these behaviors had large systematic consequences. One of the difficulties from a research point of view is trying to figure out where the irrationality occurs. For instance, if firms know that individuals are stupid, it is rational for them to exploit that. So you see sometimes firms will say, why did you pay dividends? They'll say it was rational to pay dividends because my investors were stupid and didn't understand that a share buyback could be equivalent to a dividend payout. So there are some very difficult empirical questions of locating the sources of irrationality. But I think we need better theories of persistent deviations from rationality. For instance, there's lots of evidence of momentum models, and I think it's really hard to understand that. That brings me to assumptions about rationality. Economic models really typically mean consistency. That is to say, do you choose red lettuce versus green lettuce in a consistent way? When relative prices change, do you change your relative purchases of red lettuce and green lettuces in a consistent way? Most of rationality is what economists mean is that. And the way we test that is repeated choices. But there are no repeated choices in consumption over an individual's lifetime. If at the end, and you're 65 or 75, and you say, I wish I had consumed more when I was 20, so that when I could ski, now I can't ski. You can't repeat the experiment. That information is of, in sense, no value unless you believe in recarnation. So the fact is that the intellectual foundations of intertemporal choice, where we borrow the apparatus that we use for making choices between red lettuce and green lettuce, just makes no sense. It's really not a coherent approach. And yet most of the work in modern macroeconomics has just embedded that without recognizing what they're doing. So one of the points that was made earlier was discussion about dynamic, stochastic, and general equilibrium. I actually think it's important to have dynamic models, stochastic models, and general equilibrium models. I think all three of those are important. The problem is that the standard dynamic, stochastic, and general equilibrium models makes the wrong assumptions in each of these areas. So it's not that it's dynamic, stochastic, and general. It's that it's not general, and it makes very specific assumptions. And so the real task going forward is to explore some alternative specifications. Well, as we're going about constructing a more general theory, I want to argue that there are some very simple propositions that we can take away from some very simple models, and if the model that we construct doesn't satisfy this, then we know we don't have a good model. These are necessary but not sufficient conditions for a good model, if you want to think about that. The first is that markets are not in general efficient, even when all market participants are rational, have rational expectations, and all markets are competitive. That is, whenever there are risk markets are incomplete and information is imperfect. In those situations, pecuniary externalities matter, and though they are pervasive. Actions which affect prices affect the well-being of others. And the particular example of this that was so manifest in the crisis is that individuals in their lending and borrowing decisions take the prices of real estate in each state of nature as given, even though collectively their actions affect the magnitude of the collapse of the real estate prices. And that is really the major externality, pecuniary externality that is associated with the instability that Axel was talking about and the market inefficiencies. The third observation is that whenever there are externalities, there is a role for government intervention. The notion that markets, by and large, are fine, and there are only these few instances called crises, and where we need to intervene, I think is nonsense. That is to say, if you're going to have big hospitals, and we have a very big hospital, and we had a hospital in 97 and 98, we've had bailouts over and over again. If you're going to have to save the economy, you have to take actions to prevent those kinds of things from occurring. And those crises are the tip of the iceberg of market inefficiency. So the statement that markets look pretty well, I just don't know how to evaluate. How do we know that's true? We know that it's not true, I would say, on the contrary. Fourthly, it is not in general the case that price interventions are always the optimal form of intervention. That's a very special case, even though that is a view that has become widespread in economics. Fifthly, in economies with information imperfections, agency problems are pervasive. And there have been a lot of discussion today about the importance of agency problems in helping create the crisis, so I won't go through that. And the sixth point, which is a corollary of this, is control matters. Who makes decisions makes a difference, something that's not true in the standard model. Of course, there's only one individual, so there's not much conflict. So in talking about modeling, there are four challenges that I'm not going to be able to describe, but let me just list them, because I think they're really important and they've been left out of most models. The first is bankruptcy and default. If everybody repaid their loans, everybody could get a T-bill interest rate, everybody would be safe. So the whole problem in financial markets is about default. And yet, most modeling has excluded that. And there are real costs associated with default. And just to mention one example of a theorem that you can get out of this, as your net worth gets lower and you have a stochastic model of movement of the firm, the probability of hitting default increases. If firms expect that, if lenders expect that, what will they do? They will charge a higher interest rate. And that means that the expected value of the net worth of the firm next period is going to be lower than it otherwise would have been. This gives rise to a process of trend reinforcement and is part of the process of instability that we've been talking about. The second problem is heterogeneous agents. I think are absolutely essential, and a part of that, of course, is redistributions matter. And this is really important. Somebody mentioned that this morning. In a homogeneous, in the representative agent model, you can say inequality doesn't matter, redistribution doesn't matter, because there is no scope for redistribution. But once you have heterogeneous agents, it can. The third is something that's been talked about over and over again, and I want to emphasize that I've been doing a lot of work on this, which is interlinkages, including credit interlinkages. Bruce Greenwald and I constructed models of this back in 2000, in our book in 2003. Franklin Allen did it in his book. So the fact was that there were models analyzing these credit interlinkages and their impacts, including how it can give rise to systemic risk. It's important to study the structure of the financial systems, but we actually do have lots of results of that. We know that there are differences between private incentives and social returns. We know that excessively integrated systems can be more unstable. The lunch mentioned one example of that. My paper in the AER this next month is another one. Basically, let me just talk a little bit of the mathematics here. The standard model in economics of diversification is based on strong assumptions of concavity. With those strong assumptions, you share risk and you diversify, and the system becomes more stable. But we know most systems don't have that property. Electric rigs don't have that property. We were talking lunch, some other models. So you have to ask, what's the difference between those models and the models that we use? Well, the mathematical difference is assumptions, key difference is non-convexities. Obvious example, bankruptcy. And once you incorporate these non-convexities, then you get a coherent model that can reconcile two different views. One is, when things are going well, the IMF says diversify. When things are going bad, what do they talk about? The risk of contagion. Contagion is a statement about interlinkage. They're now saying interlinkages cause problems. Well, how come they didn't talk about that when they were telling them to get interlinked? Well, they have two models in their mind. It's important to try to get those reconciled, and it is possible to do that. The fourth issue is control, which some of the work that Anton Kornek has been working on. Control matters, and one of the aspects of bankruptcy is that it leads to a shift in control. Well, let me just try to conclude. I should have probably chosen Axel strategy of putting a blank slide here and saying it's very important to incorporate these ingredients into a macro model. There are both simple analytic models that can do this and more complex stochastic models where you probably have to use computers, computer simulation. And I think from the point of view of modeling strategy, I think the economics profession really needs to probably do both. We were asked to talk about the relationship between this and regulations, and I want to just make two observations. Greenspan, in his mea culpa, said he was surprised that the banks didn't manage the risk well. The point is, he should have thought about the incentive structures facing the individuals and the organizations. And if he did that, he would have understood a little bit better why they had an incentive, not incentive to undertake excessive risk. But his real failure was a failure not to understand what his job was. That is to say, if I undertake too much risk, if I go to Las Vegas and gamble, it hurts me and I lose. It hurts me, it hurts my family, but it has no systemic consequences. The reason we have regulation is that if the banks don't do their job, and when I say the banks and the other parts of the financial system, if they don't do their job, there are large systemic consequences. There are externalities. There are macroeconomic externalities, which are particularly important, can give rise to instability. So to stabilize the economy, we have to modulate the macroeconomic externalities. To know how to do that, we need to have better models of macro and microeconomic behavior. And the alternative approaches, such as those I've tried to describe here, provide, I think, a better basis than the prevalent models. Thank you.
Well, we are out of time. You can ask the question. You can have the answer afterward. Go ahead.
Just like to ask, in the course of an hour, so very interesting talks, the word fraud was not mentioned even once. And I don't want to go through the evidence, but to point out, in the last major U.S. banking crisis, 1,000 savings and loan insiders were eventually convicted of federal felonies and in prison, including one who had 5 U.S. senators in his pocket and a future chairman of the Federal Reserve Board briefly on his payroll. Now, one reads that. And I wonder whether you wouldn't agree that in future discussions, someone capable of assessing the extent of fraud that may have underlay the present banking crisis shouldn't be included to really bring us into confrontation on the plane of the discussion of ideas.
Anyone have a 15-second answer?
Yeah, I think fraud is part of the issue here of incentives. They had incentives to behave badly because the agency issue, the consequences of their behavior were on others, and the line between fraud and non-fraud is probably a little thinner than you may think.
So let me just thank the panel and remind you that we're heading back to the room where we had lunch. So thank you.